So imagine you are working on this massive high-stakes project with a partner, right? You're building something that's going to completely impact your entire neighborhood, and you just ask to see the receipts for the supplies they've been buying to, put this whole project together.
Yeah, which is completely standard.
Right. But instead of just handing over the folder, your partner looks at you, declares that those receipts are quote-unquote personal, and promptly locks them in a heavy steel vault.
I mean, you'd be incredibly suspicious.
Exactly. Well, what if that partner is actually an elected city councilor? And what if that project isn't just some neighborhood initiative, but the actual binding laws of your city?
Yeah, well, it immediately shifts from a quirky interpersonal dispute into a massive, stress test of democratic transparency. It asks this really foundational question about how much of the government's business is actually allowed to happen in the dark.
And that is exactly the messy, really fascinating collision between private communication and public accountability that we are taking a deep dive into today. So our mission right now is to dissect a highly detailed legal ruling out of Massachusetts.
Right.
It's a July 24, 2026 ruling from Mensa Arthur, who is the Supervisor of Records for the Commonwealth. We're looking at the specific public records appeal. It's SPR262521 involving the City of Quincy, Massachusetts, and a petitioner named Leah DeGloria.
And, just a quick note for you listening before we dive into the weeds here.
Yeah.
We are dealing with active political and legal disputes today.
Yeah, absolutely.
So our goal is strictly to analyze the legal mechanics of this public records battle based on the source documents we have. We aren't taking sides or endorsing any political viewpoints. We're simply breaking down how modern transparency laws function when they're really pushed to their absolute limits.
Right, we're just looking at the machinery of it all.
Exactly. And for you listening, I want you to picture the backdrop here. This isn't just dry administrative paperwork getting filed away in some dusty municipal cabinet. This single ruling is like a masterclass in understanding the friction of modern local government.
Oh, totally.
Like teases out this central tension. What actually happens under the law when an elected official uses their own personal money to hire a private lawyer to do public work.
Right. But before we get to the really dramatic standoff between the city and this petitioner, we need to understand the strategy behind the actual records request itself. Because Leah DeGloria didn't just ask for, a generic file.
No, not at all.
On May 21st, 2026, she made this highly targeted request for records spanning from January 1st, 2026 onward, focusing on one specific identified city councilor. And looking at her request, she was just incredibly methodical.
She really was. She wasn't just fishing around.
No, she was trying to trap very specific types of information. She wanted the money trail, basically. The engagement letters, the retainers, the invoices.
Right, to prove the exact identity of the outside private attorney.
Exactly. And she also wanted the intellectual property, the actual written legal findings, the memos, the advisory documents. But the real friction point, the part that actually affects you and me the most, is that she demanded the communications.
Yeah, and that is where the legal strategy is just brilliant. She specifically requested emails, text messages, internal memoranda, and crucially, encrypted messages.
Wow.
Right. And she demanded them regardless of whether they were exchanged on city-issued accounts or personal devices. She only cared that they were used for public business regarding council authority or, the evaluation and repeal of city ordinances.
Just think about the messaging apps you use on your own phone right now. WhatsApp, Signal, iMessage. We generally treat those as inherently private spaces.
Oh, absolutely.
So the petitioner here is essentially arguing that if you are a city councilor, those private encrypted chats are fair game if you use them to discuss the repeal of a city ordinance. But, how does a public records law, which was probably originally drafted in an era of, paper memos and filing cabinets, how does it even comprehend an encrypted disappearing message on a personal iPhone?
Well, it comprehends it because the Massachusetts Public Records Law is built on a functional definition, not a technological one.
Okay, what does that mean?
So the law broadly defines public records to include all documentary materials or data, regardless of physical form or characteristics, made or received by any officer or employee of a municipality.
Okay.
And the Supervisor of Records, Mensa Arthur, she leans really heavily on this in the ruling. The law just creates this strong presumption that all governmental records are public records.
So the phrase regardless of physical form or characteristics is really doing a lot of the heavy lifting there.
It's the entire foundation.
Yeah.
The medium simply does not matter under the statute, whether it's a formal memorandum printed on, heavy stock city letterhead, or a fleeting encrypted message on a personal app, the legal test is exactly the same.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, if that data concerns municipal business
Yep.
and is received by an officer of the town, the medium doesn't magically shield it. You cannot just bypass public scrutiny simply by moving a public conversation over to a private server or a private app. The law looks at the function of the communication, not the container it sits in.
Which, on paper, that makes perfect logical sense. The petitioner asks for the records. The law dictates that the medium doesn't matter, so the city should just run a search and hand them over.
In theory, yes.
Right. But, of course, that is not what happened in Quincy. The reality of trying to enforce that broad definition led to a complete bureaucratic breakdown.
Total chaos.
Yeah. The City of Quincy initially responds to the request by essentially throwing its hands up. In their responses in June and early July, the city claims they just simply do not possess these records. They literally state that any such communications are in the sole possession of this specific counselor.
And you have to feel for them a little bit. From an administrative standpoint, the city clerk or the records access officer is in a terrible bind here.
Oh, sure.
They are the custodian of the city's servers and filing cabinets.
Right.
They're essentially telling the state, like, hey, we cannot physically hand over what is sitting on a personal device that we do not have access to or control over.
Right. Which brings us to the counselor's defense. We get this supplemental response on July 16th where the counselor lays out their legal shield, and they state that they hired a lawyer at their own cost to, quote, better understand the law.
Right.
They clarify that no public funds were used, all advice was obtained in their individual capacity, and then they officially invoke attorney-client privilege.
And that argument hinges entirely on that concept of individual capacity. The counselor is essentially attempting to build a firewall between their private self and their public office.
Right, making a clear separation.
Exactly. They're arguing that because the retainer was paid with private funds and the engagement was ostensibly for, personal education on legal matters, the entire relationship exists completely outside the jurisdiction of the city council and the public records law.
So let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because I think a lot of people listening might initially agree with the counselor on this one. Let's say a chef works at a really high-end restaurant, but they bring in their own secret, privately purchased spices to experiment with a dish in the kitchen.
Okay, I like this.
The restaurant didn't pay for the spices. Doesn't the chef own the recipe they create? Like, why shouldn't an elected official be allowed to buy their own legal advice in their individual capacity?
Well, the chef certainly owns the spices. But what happens if the chef uses those private spices to cook the official soup of the day, and then the restaurant serves it to every single customer who walks through the door?
Oh, wow, okay.
Right. At that point, the private ingredients have been converted into a public product.
I hear you on the soup of the day analogy, but doesn't attorney-client privilege technically exist the absolute second a lawyer is retained, regardless of what they are cooking up? I mean, it's a foundational legal right designed to let people seek counsel freely.
It is.
So how does a state records supervisor just override that deeply ingrained privilege simply because the petitioner suspects the end product might influence a city ordinance?
And that is the exact friction point. And it is exactly where Lita Gloria delivers her most lethal counter-argument. She doesn't just suspect the lawyer was influencing policy. She points to a literal public admission.
Wait, really?
Yeah. On July 17th, she emails the state and directs their attention to the May 18th, 2026 Ordinance Committee meeting. And at that public meeting, this same counselor openly admitted on the public record that this private outside counsel was directly utilized to draft and shape formal, binding municipal legislation.
Wait. So the private lawyer wasn't just giving the counselor, private tutoring sessions on municipal law. The lawyer was actually writing the text of the city ordinances.
According to the appeal, yes. And legally, that completely shatters the individual capacity shield.
I bet.
Because drafting binding municipal legislation is a core, fundamental legislative duty. You cannot outsource your core public duties to a private attorney, use their work product to shape the laws that govern the public, and then retreat behind the shield of individual capacity or attorney-client privilege to avoid oversight.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, if the output of that privately funded relationship becomes the public law, the public has an absolute legal right to see how that law was drafted.
So we had this massive standoff. The petitioner says, you used this lawyer to write city laws, so hand over the texts. The counselor says, my money, my lawyer, attorney-client privilege. And the way the City of Quincy handles this internally is genuinely chaotic.
It's unbelievable.
The city is being pressured by the state to provide these records, so they reach out to the councilor to ask for cooperation. And what happens? On June 27, the city receives an automated out-of-office email from the councilor.
I mean, you can't make it up. It highlights a severe structural vulnerability in local government.
It's incredible. An automated reply stating the councilor will be away until mid-July, with literally no alternate contact information provided.
And then,
The city is so paralyzed by this that on July 6th, they literally have to CC the city council president on their official state correspondence just because the actual councilor involved is completely MIA.
right, they're just trying to find anyone to talk to.
And the council president just replies that he checked his own text and has nothing to do with it. The city is basically telling the state, look, we tried, but we got an out-of-office reply, so our hands are tied.
It is the ultimate bureaucratic shoulder shrug. Everyone is just passing the buck because the administrative systems aren't designed to force compliance from a rogue actor who simply refuses to answer their phone.
So how does Manza Arthur, the supervisor of records, untangle this knot? Because she has a city playing dumb, a councilor hiding behind an out-of-office message, and a petitioner demanding encrypted text messages.
Well, Arthur steps in with the July 24 ruling by immediately resetting the baseline. She reminds the City of Quincy of the foundational rule of Massachusetts public records law.
Which is?
The burden of proof is always, without exception, on the record custodian.
Okay, meaning the burden is on the city itself, not the petitioner, and not even necessarily the councilor directly.
Correct. The law presumes everything is public. If the city wants to withhold something, or if they claim they don't have it, they have to legally prove why an exemption applies, or prove they conducted an adequate search.
Right.
Simply stating, oh, well, the councilor has it on their personal phone, is not a legally sufficient defense for a municipality. And to really drive this point home, Arthur drops a critical legal precedent from 1996.
Wait, so how does Manza Arthur actually enforce that? Like, is there a past case that gives her the authority to demand records held by a private third party?
Yes, and it's a fascinating legal mechanism.
Yeah.
She cites a case called 51 Hispanic Residents of Chelsea v. School Committee of Chelsea.
Okay.
So back in the late 80s and 90s, the city of Chelsea's public school system was struggling severely. The city took this unprecedented step and contracted with a private institution, Boston University, to completely manage and run the public school district.
But wait, a private university running a public school district?
Exactly. A private entity takes over a core traditional public function. Naturally, the residents eventually want to see the records of how their schools are being run.
Right, of course they do.
And when the residents requested the records, Boston University refused. They argued that they were a private institution, completely separate from the government, and therefore not subject to the public records law.
Which, I mean, technically they are private.
Right. But the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court stepped in and established a functional test for what they call an agency relationship.
So what is that actual legal test? Like, how does a court define an agency relationship when all the paperwork says the entity is private?
Well, the court didn't just look at the title on the door. They looked at the mechanics of control. The test basically comes down to a few key factors. First is the private party performing a traditional public duty.
Managing a school system clearly qualifies.
Obviously. Second, who has ultimate authority? The court found that even though Boston University was running the day-to-day operations, they were still subject to the ultimate control and oversight of the public school committee.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Yeah, the court ruled that when a public entity contracts with a third party to fulfill public duties and retains that overarching control, the private entity becomes a public agent. Therefore, their records relating to those duties are public records.
So Manza Arthur is taking that 1996 logic regarding a university running a school district and applying it to our 2026 situation in Quincy. It's an agency trap.
It is a brilliant application of the law. Arthur advises the city that if this private attorney was fulfilling public duties, specifically drafting municipal legislation at the direction of their councilor, an agency relationship may very well exist.
Wow.
And here is the absolute kicker of her ruling. Arthur states that keeping original public records in a private location does not sever the public's right to access them.
So you cannot launder public records by keeping them in a private briefcase or on a private encrypted app like Signal. The location of the record is totally irrelevant if the function of the record is municipal business. Like, if it drafts city ordinances like a duck, it's a public duck.
Precisely. The custodian still has an absolute duty to make those records available, regardless of whose server they are sitting on.
Okay, I understand the legal theory, but let me push back on the reality of this. I am looking at the ultimate order Manza Arthur hands down at the end of this document. She gives the City of Quincy 10 business days to clarify the relationship between the counselor and the private attorney.
Right.
The city has to legally determine whether the records were in furtherance of city business and hand over a formal response to the petitioner, who then has 90 days to appeal. Practically speaking, how does the City of Quincy actually execute this?
It's a challenge, for sure.
Like, how do they force a ghosting counselor or some unnamed private lawyer to hand over their private encrypted texts within 10 days? Is this order actually enforceable, or is it just a sternly worded letter from the state?
Oh, it is far more than a stern letter. It is a legal mechanism that completely removes the city's ability to play dumb. It forces the City of Quincy to formally investigate its own officials.
How does it force an investigation, though?
By giving them 10 days, the state is legally establishing that "I don't have it on my desk" is an invalid defense.
Oh, right.
The city can no longer just forward an out-of-office reply and claim they tried their best. They are now under a state mandate to make a formal legal determination about whether this agency relationship exists.
So they have to actually go and ask.
Yes, they have to ask the counselor directly. Did this lawyer draft legislation? If the city determines the answer is yes, and the counselor still refuses to hand over the communications, it instantly escalates the conflict.
It becomes a much bigger deal.
Exactly. It moves from a simple records dispute into a potential violation of municipal duties and state transparency laws. The state is essentially telling the city, you are the custodian. It is your legal responsibility to figure out what your agents are doing off-site, and you have 10 days to report back.
Which puts the city's own legal department on the hook. They have to decide whether to protect the counselor or comply with the state.
Exactly. The burden is entirely on the city to clarify the scope of that relationship and prove, with absolute legal certainty, whether those withheld records were created in furtherance of city business.
Which brings us back to you, the listener. Because why does a hyper-specific records dispute in Quincy, Massachusetts matter to you, wherever you happen to live?
Right, it's a fair question.
Well, because this is a universal problem. We're living in an era where every single politician, from a local zoning board member to a federal senator, has a smartphone in their pocket. They all have access to encrypted messaging apps that leave literally no trace.
And they all have access to private donors and private funds.
Exactly. The line between what a politician does in their personal capacity and what they do as a public duty is blurrier today than it has ever been in human history.
It is incredibly blurred, and the technology is just outpacing the traditional oversight mechanisms. If we aren't careful, the current technological landscape allows for shadow governments to operate entirely via private encrypted text messages, completely insulated from the voters they actually serve.
And this July 24 ruling shows that transparency laws are fighting back. They are adapting to the technology. The state is drawing a hard line in the sand, saying that it doesn't matter if you use an encrypted app, and it doesn't matter if you paid the lawyer with your own credit card.
Right.
If you are doing the public's business, if you are writing the laws that govern the public, the process belongs to the public.
Which is absolutely vital for accountability. I mean, if the public cannot see the inputs, who is advising the lawmakers, who's drafting the text word? They cannot trust the outputs.
And that leaves us with a final, lingering question to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. We've spent this time talking about a single counselor hiring a private lawyer to help draft ordinances. But let's take that concept to its logical extreme.
Okay.
If an elected official is legally allowed to rely on an off-the-books, privately funded lawyer to actually write the laws that govern a city, who is really running the town?
Yeah, it raises a really profound question about influence and the privatization of the legislative process itself.
Like, does this open the door for wealthy individuals or even massive corporations to privately bankroll personal legislative drafting teams for compliant politicians? Imagine a scenario where a corporation says, hey, counselor, we know city resources are tight. Here's a team of private, high-priced lawyers, completely free of charge, to help you understand the law in your individual capacity.
Oh, wow.
Right. If they can do that and keep the communication secret, they completely bypass the scrutiny of the public legal departments.
It entirely bypasses the checks and balances inherent in a municipal government. The public legal department works for the city and the taxpayers. A privately funded lawyer works for whoever is paying their retainer.
It takes those receipts we talked about at the very beginning, the receipts for building the actual laws of your city, and it doesn't just lock them in a vault. It gives the combination of that vault to the highest bidder while the public is left completely in the dark.
It is a genuinely unsettling thought.
It really is, and it shows exactly why these local public records battles are so fiercely fought. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sometimes murky, always fascinating waters of public accountability and transparency laws. Keep asking to see the receipts. We'll see you next time.